At various points in the growing season, you may be asking yourself this question: how do I keep insects off my plants? And in order to effectively answer that question, we have to first ask ourselves, why are insects on our plants? First, I'm going to get into the why, and then I'm going to go over different strategies that we can use to keep certain insects off of our plants. Why are insects hanging out on our plants? So I want to go down this checklist, and that'll give us a good idea as to why and if action on our part needs to be taken. So first off, the identification. Is this insect a beneficial insect, or is it a pest? Sometimes we can confuse the bad guys for the good guys, or vice versa. And it's also good to take note if we see both of these types of insects on the same plant. Because in many cases, some of these beneficial insects are eating and attacking the pest insects, right? And so that is natural ecological balance at work. If we only see the bad guys on the plant, then we want to take into account how many do we see, right? Do we only see a few, or do we see a lot? If we only see a few, and we have identified this insect pest to not be a foreign invasive species, we might not have to take any direct action at all. Second on the list is nutrient imbalance. Oftentimes our soils are not in a fully healthy, functional state, right? They may be lacking in certain nutrients, or they may be lacking in certain microbes or microbial communities that would otherwise make an adequate supply of nutrients available to the plants. So we may have some things we have to address there, right? With amendments to the soil, or compost, cover crops, plant diversity, things of that nature, to help get the soil health up to a higher state of functioning. Because oftentimes healthier soil equals healthier plants, right? And these plants then are at least a little bit better able to defend themselves against some of the pests that may be out there. Also, we have to watch the nitrogen fertilizing, right? Because if we add an excess of nitrogen to a lot of different crops, these crops will take up that nitrogen, and those crops with the higher nitrogen levels will be a lot more enticing, right? A lot more attracting to some of these pest insects, like aphids, for example. For further reading, I have attached an article down in the description that goes over the excess nitrogen in plants and how that can become more attractive to insects. Next on the list, we also want to talk about extra floral nectaries, right? So certain plants like elderberry and the perennial woolly bean, among other plants as well, can produce extra floral nectaries. And what that means is that they produce nectar on surfaces like leaves, for example, other than in the flower, right? And so a lot of insects will land on these plants and be able to sustain themselves off of this nectar that's produced on the plant. And that's not a bad thing at all. Those plants are actually producing the nectar to help sustain those beneficial insects, because those beneficial insects are what help to keep the pest populations down and the plants healthier. The next point I really want to talk about is incomplete environmental adjustment. So what do I mean by incomplete environmental adjustment? I've simplified this concept down into 3 steps. Step 1 is a sudden change on the landscape. This sudden change, it can encompass a variety of examples, right? Both natural, maybe intense floods, maybe wildfires, or human-induced, where land is clear-cut or excessively tilled, or where we once had a diversity of plants, we now have a monoculture, a monocrop of a single plant. Even with some of our genetically modified crops like corn and soy and cotton, especially like BT corn and BT cotton, initially the primary pest might get taken out and killed by trying to consume these crops. So that primary pest has been mitigated. However, that opens the door for a secondary pest, like the brown marmorated stink bug on BT cotton, for example. right? That stink bug is not affected by BT. And then on a similar note, we also have any of the pesticide applications, generally speaking, right? Certain herbicides might knock out beneficial plants. Certain insecticides may knock out pests, and then you can't support the beneficials. So basically, this sudden change in a landscape, it's like wiping the slate clean, and that is what's going to cause an imbalance. Now, if we plant a crop in a place that has or is currently undergoing a sudden change in the landscape, it's often going to knock out or diminish the beneficial plants on the landscape and the beneficial insects, because you can't support that life. So when you plant that crop, it's going to be a lot more susceptible to the pest insects, right? Because these pest insects are like the next step in this succession. And with none of the beneficial aspects in place, these pests are going to more than likely thrive, right? And they are going to create a population that's just out of control. So these insect pests are going to initially respond to this freshly planted crop. And then eventually this can lead into the third phase in the process, where the beneficial insects enter the scene, right? And then they will start going after the pest insects. However, this can take a little bit of time, and it can take more or less time depending on how we are or have been interacting with that local landscape. If we're using all those different pesticides, maybe even some of the BT crops, and we are damaging the soil ecology to a meaningful degree, then the beneficial insects are going to have a much tougher time rebounding to take care of the pest pressure. Now, we can work to shorten this time of having the beneficial insects go after the pests and kind of reestablish that natural balance by keeping these 4 points in mind. Obviously, the pests have to be present, which they will be, don't worry about that. And then we also need the supporting beneficial plants on the landscape, right? Maybe many of which can be native, and we want those rich nectary sources, those flowering plants like the umbelliferous plants, the plants in the carrot family, or the composite flowers, right, like the sunflower family, aster family, and even some of the mint family plants as well, and allowing those plants to go to flower. We also want to make sure that we are minimizing the use of pesticides, because the pesticides will not only directly attack and kill the insect pests as they're designed to do, but they will also directly knock out the beneficial insect population, because some of these beneficial insects can also be susceptible to the toxins in these pesticides. And then they can also indirectly affect these beneficial insects by in the case of herbicides, taking away some of those beneficial plants or some of those weeds, right, that those beneficials might be able to subsist on otherwise. And of course, obviously, those pesticides also attack the pests, which are a food source and a very necessary part of the beneficial insect's livelihood. And then lastly, we also want to minimize tillage, right? Maybe we have certain crops or certain areas of the field that we have to till, and that's fine, but we also want to have and maintain some areas on that landscape or in that field or in those fields that is not going to be touched by a rototiller or any tillage type of equipment. And that's because some of these beneficial insects have to have a place to overwinter. And if we go through and till late in the fall or early in the spring, that will effectively turn up and kill a lot of these beneficial insects, and it can dramatically reduce the stability of the soil environment, right, to support the lives of these larvae or pupa of these beneficial insects that are on the landscape. So basically, if we are keeping these 4 points in mind and we are integrating them into that landscape, either beforehand or during, to kind of ease that transition, we are effectively working to complete that environmental adjustment, right? And to help decrease the severity of those pest infestations so that balance can be reasserted and everything can be good. Additionally, I also want to make a special note that we need a low number of pests on the landscape, right? Insect pests, because we need those pests to sustain the lives of the beneficial insects, right? That's how the ecology works. If we don't have the pests, then we don't have the beneficial insects, and then we eventually will have the pests. Then the beneficial insects will have to re-inhabit the area, and that is not an ideal situation to be in. So if we can manage to have a small number of insect pests on the landscape, maybe even on some of our crops, it can be to a level that it's not going to be at a meaningful economic damage. We just have to make sure that the beneficial insects are in place, and that maybe we have other flowering plants around that can attract and sustain these beneficial insects on that local landscape. And finally, this idea on perspective, right? So we have the monarch butterfly and we have the Colorado potato beetle, right? Both of these species are native to North America. However, for one of these species, we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources in trying to save this species from extinction or endangerment. And for the other species, we essentially are trying to exterminate it off the face of the planet. The monarch caterpillar will eat the foliage of the milkweed plant, right? If the milkweed plant was a more recognized food source, we might take a little bit more issue to that. But for the Colorado potato beetle, its larva eats the foliage of the potato plant. However, when we look at the monarch butterfly consuming the milkweed, we see the greater value in the monarch butterfly. And when we see the Colorado potato beetle consuming the potato plant, we see a greater value in the potato. But we can also see a great value in the Colorado potato beetle itself. While it may force many to incur economic losses in certain situations, this insect also has its own role to play on the landscape, and it probably has a variety of roles, some which we may not even yet know. But the ultimate lesson in this is that the milkweed, the monarch butterfly, the Colorado potato beetle, and the potato are all important, right? They're all part of the ecology. They are all part of that whole system. So now we can close out with some solutions. And these solutions are really just steps in a process, right? So step one would be the positive identification. Is this insect beneficial or is it a pest? And if we identify it to be a specific pest, then we might also be able to research some specific options, right, for control, right? Step two is especially relevant to prevention, right? We want to build the soil health, right? So that those nutrients in the soil profile are more accessible to the plants, and that way the plants can be healthier versions of themselves. So we want to focus on fertilizing the soil, so to speak, right? We don't want to focus on fertilizing the plants. We really want to have the focus on the soil health, not solely on the plant health. Because if we only focus on growing larger, more abundant crops, that may actually in turn make these crops more susceptible to pest damage, right? Specifically, if we are over fertilizing these crops, right, especially with nitrogenous based fertilizers and things like that. So we just want to make sure that we're not over applying those fertilizers. Third on the list, we have to ask ourselves, what is attracting this insect to this plant, right? Is this plant an extrafloral nectary? Is this a beneficial insect that is just searching for the chemical signals to help it locate a pest? And then number four, we want to work to facilitate the completion of that environmental adjustment. So if we have worked through those first three steps and we still have a problem, that means that we need to intervene. So ideally, we want to intervene as indirectly as possible. We want the ecosystem, we want the ecology to be able to be fully functional. And so this is going to take a bit of doing, right? A little bit of research. We're going to have to identify the pest, and we will have to identify what are the predators of that pest, and then learn what attracts the predators, right, those beneficial insects, like maybe certain types of plants, and make sure that those plants are available on the local landscape in meaningful populations. Or is there something out of balance in the plant biochemistry, right? So there are kind of two routes you can take with the ecological health, like the beneficial insects, but then you can also look at the plant health, right? Are we over-fertilizing with something? Is the soil not in good health? Does it have poor drainage? Is the pH off? All those different things that we want to make sure we consider. And there's another point to make, and I don't have it on here because I don't see it as a solution. I see it as more of like a band-aid, and that is direct intervention, right, for the pest. So as humans, you know, if we are physically picking off the insects or applying some type of deterrent or repellent or some type of spray that will repel or kill, in some cases, some of these insects, it always seems that nature has a way of overriding these band-aids eventually over time, right? We can talk about insecticide resistance, other ecological imbalances that may lead to other manifestations, and then some of these insecticides, even like the certified organic ones or OMRI approved or whatever, still can kill, in many cases, non-target insect species. So depending on the specific pesticide, it can kill our pollinators like bees, or they can also kill or weaken other beneficial insect species as well, and that's going to throw the ecology further out of balance. And then also on the note of number 4, facilitating the completion of that environmental adjustment, we may also have to adjust our own growing strategies, right? Like we might not want to monocrop something, but space plantings out into like parcels or plots, right? Because smaller plots and having a greater diversity overall of plants in a field can actually work to kind of confuse, in some cases, some of the pest insects, and it can also work to harbor more habitat for the beneficial insects and other predators on that landscape. Number 5 deals with the character trait of acceptance. Not always the most popular concept in agriculture, but it is very crucial and very important that nothing in nature is going to be perfect, or at least it's not going to be our version of perfect. There will always be some occasional scar on an apple. There will be bite marks in plant leaves. It is all part of functioning ecology, right? We need both the pests and we need the beneficials. And so we need that balance to make this system work. So as Helen et al. In her book, The Ecological Farm, mentions that anywhere up to 5 to 10% of crop damage of any one crop is perfectly acceptable. And I know that might be a bit of a difficult statement here because we're so often focused, more often than not, out of necessity of maximizing yield, right? Because we want to maximize profit. But in order to have a more stable and reliable source of yield, of production, we need to take this into account. And also on that note, if we do crop scouting and we're looking out in the field and we see a pest insect presence that's greater than 10% damage or so, then that's basically a threshold, right, where we can at that point begin to take action, right? And then finally, of course, we discussed number 6, perspective. Any kind of pest or beneficial insect, it's all kind of a label, right? And so the ideal is balance. Any insect, any plant out there has its own value, has its own reason for being on the landscape. And in a way, maybe it's kind of our job to discover and appreciate that reason, and all the while making sure that the overall balance is maintained or attained on the landscape. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this video on keeping insects off of our plants and why they might be on our plants in the first place. And we also know now that some insects on our plants is actually not a bad thing. We have the beneficials, which may serve as pollinators for these plants, or some of these beneficials may also go after some of the pest insects. And on that note, we also need some pest insects on our plants in order to maintain that ecological balance. So thank you so much for checking out this video, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.